It's been almost a month since we launched Condos, Burbs and Barns, our series on the places Canadians live. And in that time, the concept has seen rapid expansion to include apartments, couches, and even yurts. This morning, you can add fire towers to that list. Vivian Demuth is one of more than 120 people who spend their summers perched on fire towers across Alberta, looking out for lightning strikes. She's done the job for 13 years, and she spends the other half of each year in New York City. Jim McQuarrie is our Edmonton producer, and he's back this morning from a trip to Nose Mountain and a visit with Vivian. Jim, good morning.
How are you, Sheila?
I'm well, thanks, and you?
I'm good.
Take me to Nose Mountain. Where is it? How do you get there, and what's the tower like?
What you need to do is you need to drive carefully when you're going to Nose Mountain, but I'll get to that in a bit. To start with, it's location-wise, it's about 100 kilometers south and west of Grande Prairie, which puts it right in the shadow of the Rockies. It's a beautiful, beautiful location. I drove up from Edmonton, so the other geography thing is if you head 500 kilometers north and west of Edmonton, you get to Nose Mountain Tower. But it ain't easy. You need a four-wheel drive, especially if it's rained recently. And Sheila, the day I left, it had. So I had to take a logging road, which kind of devolved into a much smaller logging road called Muddy Creek, which lived up to its name.
Yeah.
And before I got there, I was stopped and helped at a logging checkpoint by a guy who heard where I was going, kind of scratched his head in a very disconcerting way and said, well, if you were trying this yesterday, I'd say you won't make it. But today you might. So I was a little bit nervous on the way up.
Yeah, I love that might word.
Exactly.
Well, you wouldn't be here if you weren't successful, I assume.
Oh, you gave it away. Yeah, a few wrong turns, a few of those kind of roads that even goats might turn their noses up, and I got there. Vivian Demuth has this small pan-abode cabin on a ridge. It's on the west side of Nose Mountain, so you can see towards those lovely foothills. There's an outhouse just off to one side, quite a classy-looking outhouse. There's a garden off in the bush that's surrounded by netting to keep the deer out. And there's this 60-foot tower that she climbs on a regular basis to keep an eye on things once she has her safety gear on.
This is a full body harness, red and blue in color, and I'm putting it over my shoulders. I have to put this on before I climb the tower. And so once I have it over the shoulders, I put on the leg. My name's Vivian Demuth, and I've been working at Nose Mountain Fire Tower for 13 years. Every May I come out, and I'm here till the end of September, depending on how busy the fire season is. And then in October sometime I head to New York where my partner is, and I work part-time there with homeless people. Something we had to get used to recently. And then I have a walking carabiner to put into the harness, and this ascender clips onto a wire that goes all the way up the tower, up to the cupola, from the bottom to the top. For me, it feels like a healthy balance. One is a relationship with the natural world, and I'm a human being in a minority, surrounded by animals and plants, and then the other is a relationship with people. It is quite the opposite. In New York, a lot of trees are on tops of buildings, but I like that balance. It's a privilege to experience both of those living communities. Thousands of times over the years. Never fallen once or slipped. Even before, without the harnesses. So. Well, when I first get here, I feel like a weakling. I feel out of shape. And then climbing the tower throughout the summer helps to get me in shape, and hiking as well. And sometimes I have to run up the tower, and it's a nice way to keep physically healthy.
Jim, I felt like I was right there. And
I was.
And I know you were indeed. But were you breathing heavily from the climb?
Well, unfortunately, I didn't get my recording equipment off my shoulder fast enough to get my own heavy breathing. But yeah, I was too. But then, I am 55, which is about 6 years older than Vivian, and I'll let you do the math.
Well, Alberta wilderness to downtown New York. Talk about the yin and yang of Vivian's life.
Yeah, I can't imagine any more extreme thing, but she really takes it in stride. I mean, she's a very philosophical individual, which you'd kind of expect because she's a poet. Now, she was born in Ontario. Her connection with New York came after she met her partner there during a poetry reading. So that's kind of romantic, don't you think?
Sure.
But it's the yin and yang that really attracted me to this story. I mean, what kind of woman not only survives but thrives in such a remote location and then flies into one of the most crowded places on the continent and finds comfort in such a radically different environment? I can't imagine that kind of life myself.
Me neither, but tell me about her time in New York.
Well, we didn't get into that too much, but she kind of describes her New York life as relatively sheltered from that kind of stereotypical busyness that everyone thinks of when they think of New York. She lives in the arts community, which is, kind of a different but probably equally vibrant community to the ecosystem that she lives on Nose Mountain. And the other nice thing about it, of course, is that the arts community is very connected to social issues like homelessness, and those are really close to her heart. But, she will admit that the view from the air over New York when she's flying in or out is not nearly as attractive as the view from that fire tower. And she took me up there, as we heard. And while we were up there, once I'd caught my breath, Vivian kind of told me a little bit about the work.
And we're up on a 60-foot tower. And right now I'm looking to my west, to the BC border. And you can see some more foothills and roads and the boreal forest and the Rocky Mountain Divides and a glacier there in BC. And some clear cuts and a few gas plants and oil flares. XMA 733, XMB 811120, you buy, Doug?
This is XMA 733, go ahead.
During the busy days, it can be quite stressful because you're responsible for catching smokes when they're really small, and you have to report them within 5 minutes of seeing them.
WS0600, that's the location of the new fire.
So we're up in the cupola, the tower, all day, and we're doing observations every 15 minutes, which means we scan 360 degrees in our area, which is about 40 kilometers around.
We've hit the second fire. I believe it's fire 58 now.
But when it's extreme hazard, there's a bit of tension because you never know when a smoke could start. I have gotten nervous in some of the lightning storms when you can. My hair has actually risen and things start to crackle. But we're supposed to stay up here if it's not a severe storm and watch where the lightning lands because you can get a fire start up to a week after lightning has hit an area. It can be quite nerve-wracking, but I tend to calm myself, breathe and remind oneself that the tower is grounded.
She sounds very grounded, too, I must say.
She is very grounded, despite the fact she's 60 feet in the air. Yeah.
Sure. I'd be grateful to know that it's grounded. A little thing like getting hit by lightning could just ruin your whole day.
Mm-hmm.
There must be natural hazards that go beyond storms, too, eh, Jim?
Well, yeah. I mean, that's kind of the flip side of the job description. Great view, peaceful setting, but very exposed to the weather and very exposed to the wildlife, for that matter. I mean, Vivian has been chased by wolves. She's watched grizzlies from her front porch, things like that. And Sheila, it doesn't scare her. It delights her.
One time I came out here early in the morning just to check on my garden, and the netting was open like that. So someone had been in, and I looked in, and there were these giant grizzly bear tracks about 12 inches. And the bear had stepped around all my plants. He didn't damage any, like sometimes they're attracted to plastic. He didn't touch anything, and he walked back out the same way. I never saw the bear. I just had seen these tracks for the past few years in the spring. It's around 3 in the morning, and there's lightning around. Last year, a couple days before I closed the tower, whoa, there's a strike. I saw a couple wolves on my road here, and there's a bit of snow and ice on the road. And anyhow, I thought I'd see if I could call the wolves. So I did some wolf calls, and all of a sudden, 4 more wolves came out of the bush with the 2, so there was a 6-pack of wolves running towards me, and I could hear them on the ice, cha-chung, 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 coming towards me. So I ran to get my camera, came back out on the porch. They stopped, and then they turned away.
I love your thunder. That's amazing.
It was her thunder, yeah.
Yeah, her thunder. Wolves, bears, woman alone.
Uh-huh.
I know you said that she feels it's delightful, but really, I mean, isn't there just an element where your hair is going to stand on end?
She actually says that she feels safer in the wilderness than she does in the city. I mean, she's well qualified to make that determination. But you know what's funny? At the same time, she says she feels closer to life and death out in the wilderness because, well, let's face it, carnivores eat their breakfast on her front lawn, and she often finds the leftovers, deer toes, wolf scat, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
But, the wild encounters, they're not an issue. What did shake her up, and this was really badly, was 2 incidents that happened during the summer of 2006. 2 awful things happened just weeks apart that had a huge impact on her and the whole fire tower community.
We have radios, cell phones, emergency buttons that we can press if there's an emergency, but we've never had to use them. And it's very rare, like in the over 50 years that there have been fire towers. There hasn't been serious security issues until recently. It was such a traumatic summer last year for fire lookouts because I also had a helicopter crash here the month before Stephanie Stewart went missing, a 70-year-old woman who worked on a fire tower. We were just very sad and in shock. And it's still sad that we don't know what happened to her. So this is a helipad, and you'll see the fuel drums over there. And I had a helicopter accident here last summer, and the helicopter had refueled and was taking off from this point and heading over towards the ridge here to go west. And it just crashed over down the hill here. I saw it twirl first, it went into rotation. I knew they were in trouble. I called forestry headquarters in Grand Prairie. It seemed to slow down. I just have a memory of that twirling being very slow. I worked as a park ranger and park warden, so I had some, and I've also trained as an emergency medical technician, so I had some experience. And Darcy Moses was still in the helicopter, and I did CPR on him, but unfortunately he passed away. And a forest ranger lost some limbs, and it all happened so fast and was such a shock. And I actually went for some trauma counseling. Here comes a helicopter, speaking of helicopters.
Well, so much for the quiet summer in the bush. But she says there's no word on what happened to Stephanie Stewart. Is that still the case, Jim?
Well, unfortunately, yes. I mean, and I can only imagine what that's doing to Stephanie Stewart's family. It was a year ago last August that she disappeared. And police say given what else was missing from the fire tower, they can only suspect foul play, but they simply don't know.
Well, so there's Vivian getting away from the turmoil and the sirens and the honking of the city, only to find human death and destruction literally on her doorstep. It's got to be difficult to deal with.
Well, it certainly is, but it's also interesting that same kind of yin and yang extreme that happens between the Alberta wilderness and New York City also kind of happens at the Outlook itself, because, I mean, she has these days of Bucolic Quiet where she does a couple of weather reports and collects flowers to make these herbal lotions that she makes and writes and thinks. And then the fire hazard rating goes through the roof, and she's surrounded by lightning strikes in a dark tower for long hours. And then she has to cope with this awful carnage. And, in some ways, it's kind of a symbol of what she sees as an unsettling progression. She's seen huge changes in that landscape in the 13 years that she's been working at that tower. A kind of, expanding industrial invasion, gas drilling and clear cutting. Yeah. And it truly troubles her. I mean, her job is to protect the forest from fires, but there are these other more insidious human threats that really weigh in her mind.
She tends to weigh things in her mind, and I suppose as a poet, that shows up in her writing.
Oh, absolutely. She read me a few things, but one in particular really hit me. It was one of her more recent poems, and it reflects the questions about life and death that were, accentuated, as you can imagine, by that chopper crash.
And this is a poem I wrote up here called I've Been Calling Them. It's actually a sonnet. For a long time, I have been calling them without reply. I smell them in the DNA hills of my boreal bed. I see them waiting on a black forest coat of male arms. I hear them arguing, tongues flying in native winds. I rub their dark feathers dipped in a dry Alberta stream as I write in the rocky darkness to talk with them. For a long time, I have been calling them without response. And after I saw the twirling precision helicopter crash, after I ran downhill into the smell of crushed metal and dreams, after I touched a cold firefighter's blue-winged lips with the erratic cry of my breath, then I called them again while walking alone in logged woods, and for once the giant ravens croaked and lifted me as we listened to our breath alight in tall evergreens.
That's beautiful.
Yeah.
So how has that traumatic summer that this poem inspired affected her will to stay at the tower?
Well, not at all. It's interesting she talks about DNA in that poem, and I think that tower is in her DNA now. I think it's fair to say she needs to return to that landscape, and she feels this sense of responsibility to be there, if only to witness the changes that she wishes weren't happening.
Being on the mountain, yeah, I like returning to the mountain, and I just miss the being with the trees and the birds and just sitting on the mountain and looking out and not having the noise of the city, and it's just refreshing to come back here. I suppose it's like a spiritual need to come back to this community, this living community. And I just love being out here, and I don't know, I would try to inspire people before they die to spend a week alone in a wilderness location without humans around, or maybe someone in a distance that they could wave to but not talk to. It's a real wonderful, mysterious experience to spend time alone in a relatively wild area, and might change things, might awaken you to a sense of contentment with very little.
Where's Vivian now, Jim?
Well, she climbed down from her fire tower about a week ago, and last I heard she was at a community just north of Vancouver and making plans to get back to New York City. But, I don't think there's any question. You just have to listen to the tone of her voice. Next May, she's going to be back at that fire tower on Nose Mountain.
Jim, thank you for taking us there and for adding something really interesting to our series, Condos, Burbs, and Barns.
It was my pleasure.